welcome back to Storytime with Alex, reading from Allbyon to Britannia, Book 2, The Last Witch of Old Albion, written, designed and illuminated by Brandy Pearson. We're now on to Chapter 1. We had the prologue last time that introduced some of our characters and some strange dreams they'd been having, and some stories that they were telling. And now we're on Chapter 1, Have You Seen Our Cat? Trying something slightly new with my phone stand, so let's see if it stays up. Okay. Have you seen our cat? It was the beginning of November in the following year. I was now in the second half of my first term at high school. I'd gone from being not unstupid, well, quite brainy and moderately tall, to being a dumb little first year. I'd survived the first half term rather than getting any pleasure out of it, and slept through quite a lot of the half-term break. I was now getting used to it, had a little more energy, and there seemed to be one or two people I might make friends with eventually, but I was longing for a puzzle to solve, a Fortean phenomenon to explore, just something strange to think about that was nothing to do with school, when I noticed the cats, or at least the lack of cats. I was on my way home when I saw the first poster pinned to a tree. Missing, Dexter, it said at the top in large bold font, over a picture of a black cat with one white ear and four white paws sitting on a green sofa. Underneath it said, "From Beacon Lane, last seen on Saturday, November the 1st. Please look in any sheds or cellars. Reward for return and a phone number." I imagined finding the cat and getting the reward. I decided to keep a sharp eye out. Mum and Dad said I wasn't old enough for a smartphone, despite my school being full of them, so I had to carry my digital camera around with me with a notebook and pen. I remembered him sitting on the window ledge of his house, waiting for someone to come home and let him in. It must have been one day when I was going over to the big park. He was the second cat that I knew of to go missing in the Triangle in the couple of days since the Halloween party. Mr. Jackson, who lived near the railway, had asked me to keep an eye out for his cat Tommy when I'd been sent to buy milk in the little supermarket by the station. I should tell you a bit more about myself, I know, because my dad told me that my name, Miles, means soldier in Latin. One of my grandfathers, who mercifully lives at the other end of the country, was still calling me my little soldier when we went to see him. He has stopped now that I'm taller than him. However, I like the idea that my name is also a measure of distance. I like numbers and lists, puzzles and patterns. I read my dad's Fortean Times, the Journal of Strange Phenomena, and try to have an open mind. I am also fond of cats. Unlike dogs, they do not love you in that over-the-top way, as if you were the most wonderful person in the whole world. Cats treat you like equals. They let you feed them, stroke them, and sometimes pick them up, but only if they feel like it. We'd moved into the Triangle when I was 4. I remember big strong men like gorillas carrying tables and chairs and shelves and beds into our new house and putting them where my mum told them. They're bringing all the stuff from our old house in big boxes and piling them up in every spare space. Then they went away, and I remember Mum sitting in the new front room on a dining chair, surrounded by the boxes and being very cross. Then the doorbell rang. "Oh, who on earth can that be?" Mum had muttered. There was an old lady at the door, dressed in black, except for a frilly white collar peeping over the top of her woolly cardigan. She was carrying a tray covered in a blue and white cloth. "Hello," she said. "Welcome to the Triangle. I'm Miss Phillips. I live next door, and I thought that you might like a cup of tea and a jam scone or two. I bought some apple juice for the little boy in case he doesn't like tea." She had smiled at me. Immediately I liked her smile. She'd put down the tray on one of the large boxes and pulled off the cloth like a magician revealing a trick. There was a flowery china teapot, matching cups and saucers, a milk jug and a sugar bowl. There was also a glass of apple juice and a plate of scones with little plates to put them on. They matched too. "You must be my guardian angel," Mum said, looking alarmingly as if she were going to cry. Miss Phillips patted her on the arm, smiling. We had all been good friends ever since. If Mum and Dad went out for the evening, I usually went round to Miss Phillips's house. Although she told us her first name, which was May, not even Mum and Dad could bring themselves to call her that. After a while we just called her Miss P, which she seemed to like. After Mum went back to work full time when I was 7, Miss P would pick me up from school and take me home to her house until either Mum or Dad got home from work. Now that I had reached the giddy heights of high school, I was allowed, indeed encouraged, to come home on my own, but I still went to Miss P's for a cup of tea and a homemade Coke? That's a whole different story. A homemade cake of some description. Then I usually did some of my homework, because her house was calm and quiet, and, as she said, conducive to study. I wanted to tell her about the 2 missing cats, but I couldn't at the moment because she was in hospital. I would have to wait until I could visit her. I've not told you about the triangle yet. It's a sort of island of 3 roads: Albury Road, Everlast Road and Beacon Lane. They fit into a triangular space between the overground railway line, the motorway and Station Road. The only way in and out by car is from Station Road down Albury Road. There's a footpath that goes under the railway line, which is up on an embankment at the corner where Albury Road meets Beacon Lane, and a footbridge halfway along Beacon Lane over the motorway, which is down in a cutting. It was actually called the Albury Triangle Conservation Area. It says so on the notice board on the little green where Albury Road meets Everlast Road. We live in the corner where Everlast Road meets Beacon Lane. Behind our house were the shops and offices on Station Road. Miss P's cottage was even more in the corner than ours, and her garden was an odd shape, unlike the rectangular gardens of most of the houses. It was an experiment in urban living, and the houses were all built in the 1920s. They were in a style I now know is called mock Tudor, with white plaster and black beams, and had sloping roofs with red tiles. There were 160 houses, all semi-detached, with drives up the side which were not quite wide enough for modern cars, so lots of the gardens had been paved over for parking. There were lots of trees and grassy bits along the pavements and in the corners. Most of the houses in the surrounding area were tall, thin, terraced Edwardian brick villas, and a few blocks of much newer flats, so the triangle was like another world. Right in the middle, behind the houses, there was Albury Gardens. Not big enough to be a park, but too big to be a garden. There was a big round hump in the middle that people said used to be where they would light great fires to warn that enemies were sailing up the Thames. It was a good place to play when I was small, but it wasn't a very high spot, so Dad said that was unlikely. He thought it might be where there used to be a fountain. There was a community centre halfway along Albury Road, next to the main entrance to the gardens, a dark green wooden building with a veranda. The nearest shops were along Station Road. The nearest pub, the Rose and Crown, and the nearest primary school, where I went, were reached through the foot tunnel under the railway. It was a long way around in a car. Across the footbridge, over the motorway, was Albury Grange, though everyone called it the Big Park. It had big duck pond and some ancient ruins. There were no flats in the triangle, particularly no council flats, and it was fiercely protected by the Albury Gardens Resident Association group. The only house that was different was Miss P's. It was a sort of Gothic cottage, only 1 story, with pointy windows and doors. The porch at the front looked as though it was made of twisty tree branches. It was not joined to our house, which was joined to Mr. Davis's house, and had a path to her back garden on the other side. She did not have a car, and her front garden had a lawn and a curvy path and an apple tree and a bed of roses. I think her house was one of the reasons all the kids in the triangle, and some of the grown-ups, thought she was a witch. I had an open mind, like a true Fortean. I loved her house because it was full of interesting things. She let me look at them as long as I was careful. There was a tiny mechanical bear who rode a tricycle while twirling an umbrella when you wound it up, the skull of a sheep that she had found in the Lake District, a collection of glass eyeballs in a wooden case that were both fascinating and horrible, an ancient globe of the world on which Australia was called New Holland, and many, many hardback books. It reminded me of my dad's pockets that always had interesting things in them: a fossilized shark's tooth he found on a beach, a big old copper penny, a bottle top with a kangaroo on it. Miss P taught me the names of the birds that visited her garden and the plants that grew there. She used some of them to make herbal teas that were good for you. I suppose by the time I went to school and got to know the other kids, I was used to Miss P, and I certainly wasn't frightened of her. I always thought that the other kids missed out on a lot of cool stuff by not being friends with Miss P. But there you are. That's the trouble with having a closed mind. Ruth was the exception, but we'll come to her later. Even the grown-ups in the triangle thought Miss P was odd. They, whoever they were, said that Miss Phillips, with one L and two P's as you frequently had to say, had been living in her odd little cottage since before the rest of the houses in the triangle had been built. As my dad said, that would make her at least 90 years old, which was ridiculous, though she seemed very old to me. She had a TV with Freeview, though did not seem to watch it much. When I was small, she would read stories to me. Some of them were famous, like The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe and Treasure Island. Others were kept in a special folder made of leather. Stories of the Witches of Old Albion was inscribed on the front. Some of these stories were handwritten, some typed on an old-fashioned typewriter, some printed with a dot matrix printer, and others with a laser printer like the one we had at home. Miss P seemed to enjoy looking after me, and she would take me for walks on Saturdays when Mum and Dad went to the supermarket. We would walk across the footbridge, over the motorway into the big park. When I was small, I found it a bit scary, so high above the cars and lorries, and a bit exciting, watching them thunder along beneath us. We would take bread to feed the ducks on the pond. Often she would also be looking after Ruth. Ruth's mum and dad had known Miss P for years. Like me, Ruth was an only child. Her parents often seemed to be busy, and Miss P seemed happy to look after her too. We had played together without being actual friends. We never chose each other. There were just some times when Miss P would be looking after us both. Actually, when we were alone in Miss P's garden one day, I discovered that Ruth did think Miss P was a witch, but she thought that was cool. When I asked Mum and Dad, they said there were no such things as witches, but, as I said, I tried to keep an open mind. Halloween. Now that I've got this far in the story, I've realised that the story did not really begin with the missing cats. Though I did not understand it at the time, the cats going missing was linked with what had happened at the Halloween party at Miss P's house. Halloween was always fun in the Triangle. There were quite a few kids, and their parents all knew their neighbours well enough to let them go out trick-or-treating. The older people here were happy enough to have a dish of sweets by the front door, and many also had carved a pumpkin head with a lighted candle inside. Miss P really liked Halloween. She always had a really well-carved pumpkin in her porch and a candle in it. She had a plastic skull she hung on the door which would cackle when anyone approached and wish them a happy Halloween in a deep, creepy voice. She even wore a tall black witch's hat for the occasion. The other kids would knock because they knew she gave out the best sweets. They were still all a bit scared of her. This year, Halloween fell on a Friday evening and Ruth was there. I thought she had dressed up for the occasion. She blended very well with all the scary stuff in her raggedy black dress, velvet coat, black nails and black leather boots with studs and buckles. Miss P held a little party. Mum and Dad and me, Mrs. Carr from over the road and some other neighbours, and Ruth. Her mother was at a conference on the environment in Brighton, so she was staying for the weekend. I talked to her a bit. We were the only kids there. She asked me what bands I was into, which I wasn't really. I asked her about her new school. She hooted in disgust. I have to wear a bloody uniform and have a ponytail and no makeup, not even nail varnish. They tried to send me home once because I dyed some of my hair purple. My mum caused a fuss because they never send home girls who bleach it. When I get home from school on Friday, the first thing I do is put it all on and become me. That was the moment I realised that since I had last seen her, she had become a goth. I think I said, "Wow," and was very relieved when Mrs. Carr came over for a chat. After a while, all the grown-ups, except Miss P, ran out of Halloween steam and went home, including my mum and dad, leaving Ruth and I and Miss P. Ruth asked her to read us one of the stories of old Albion from the leather folder. We sat down in her sitting room in front of a real fire, and she went to get the folder. The witches in the stories were not evil and scary. They helped people with their magic, travelling around the country from village to village. They solved puzzles and helped people out. Some of the puzzles were magical, and some were about people. People, in my experience, are much more difficult to understand than a magic spell. In my new school, We were studying the Middle Ages in our history lessons, and I noticed that old Albion was like medieval England, but not quite. There were wizards in the stories too, but the witches and the wizards did not seem to get along very well. The witches' magic seemed to be sort of softer, made up as they went along, with lots of herbal teas and listening to people. The wizards' magic came out of books, and they used metal pots and crucibles and complicated spells. I was beginning to realise that the stories Miss P read to us were very biased towards the witches. I'd asked her who had written the stories, but all she would say was that a friend had given them to her, in the vague way grown-ups do when they don't want to tell you anymore. Of course, I had wondered if she was a witch when I was younger, especially when the other kids all said that she was. She had laughed and said, "So you believe in witches, do you? How interesting. You should ask your parents if they believe in witches." And I did. My dad said that there were a lot of people who said there were witches. Some believed it as a religion, others had a fevered imagination, and some were probably just pretending. I looked witches up on the internet, and there was a great deal of stuff. It was only that evening, thinking it all over, that I realised that Miss P had never denied being a witch. When I told my mum and dad that the other kids called Miss P, they said that she was a kind old lady who lived on her own, and that they did not know how they would have managed without her help, and that the other kids should have better things to do than call her names. As I was thinking about all this, Gremlin, Miss P's black cat, came in. She was another reason the local kids thought Miss P was a witch. Gremlin was very large, with big green eyes and a loud meow. She rubbed herself against Miss P's legs as she came in with the folder and purred like a small engine. At that moment there was a knock on the door. Miss P put her witch's hat back on and picked up her bowl of sweets and went to answer. We heard her laugh and call out, "Where are you then? Are you hiding behind the tree?" We heard her step out onto the porch, then a thud, and she cried out in pain. We dashed to the door. Miss P was lying on the path. The bowl had broken and scattered sweets across the garden. "I've tripped and I can't get up," she said. "I think I might have broken something. Miles, could you go and get your dad?" I ran home and Dad came and phoned for an ambulance. When it came, they loaded her on a stretcher, as she was asking Mum and Dad to care for Ruth until her mum came home on Sunday evening. As they were about to close the ambulance doors to take her to the hospital, she called out to me, "Miles, look after Gremlin for me," and then she was gone. I was shocked, and so was Ruth, who got a bit weepy. Mum closed up Miss P's house, and I fed Gremlin, who seemed extremely put out, while Dad made up the bed in the spare room for Ruth and sent a text to her mum to say where she was. Mum phoned the hospital. When the hospital said that they could only give out information to Miss P's relations, she lied and said she was her niece, so they told her. Miss P had broken her leg, and they would be keeping her in the hospital for a while. This was not the end of Halloween that I had expected. The next morning I said I would go and pick up all the sweets in Miss P's front garden and have a good look around. First, I could not see anything that she could have tripped over. The path was made of red bricks worn smooth over the many years that feet had walked over them. At first, the only thing I could find was a horizontal scratch about 10 centimetres up from the base of the twisted wooden pillar that framed her porch. I looked at the other pillar. Was there a similar scratch there? I wasn't sure. As I picked up the sweets scattered about, I found a short length of fishing line on the grass, which I picked up and put in my pocket. It took me a while to work out what this might mean. Someone tied the thread across Miss P's porch to deliberately trip her. Was that why they were hiding behind the tree? If so, it was a really mean trick. That is the end of the first chapter. Join us next time for Miss P in hospital and more missing cats.